She stood barefoot in the road, rain soaking through a dress that used to belong to a life she no longer had, and whispered the only truth left in her: "I have nowhere left to go." The men behind her laughed. The door behind her stayed shut. Then a voice came out of the dark, low and unshaken. "Funny, I have an empty house." Nobody in Cedar Hollow knew his name yet. Nobody knew what that empty house had cost him. But by morning, everything about that town and about him was about to change forever. If this story moves you, subscribe and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came down like judgment, and Margaret Ellis stood in the middle of Cedar Hollow's main road and let it soak her to the bone because she had nowhere left to stand that wasn't already someone else's property. "Please," she said, and hated the sound of her own voice, thin and cracked, begging in front of the whole town. "Please, just one night. I'll work for it. I'll do anything." Ida Fawcett stood in the lit doorway of the boarding house with her arms crossed and her mouth pulled into a hard, satisfied line, the kind of expression a woman wears when she's been waiting a long time to say no to somebody who once had more than she did. "You should have thought of that before your husband gambled away half this town's cattle money," Ida said. "Doors shut, Margaret." Was shut the moment Thomas Ellis put a bullet in his own head instead of facing what he owed. "You're not welcome under any decent roof in Cedar Hollow. Not tonight. Not ever, far as I'm concerned." Behind her, in the warm gold light of the parlor, three men Margaret didn't fully recognize laughed low into their coffee cups, the kind of laugh men give when another person's ruin makes them feel steadier about their own lives. "Ida," Margaret tried again. "It's just for the night. I have nowhere." "That's not my trouble." The door started to close. "Wait." Margaret's hand shot out, caught the frame, and for one terrible second, her whole life narrowed down to the width of that door and whether it would shut on her fingers or her future. "Please. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a roof. One night. I'll be gone by morning, I swear it." "You'll be gone tonight," Ida said, and pried Margaret's fingers loose without gentleness, and the door shut with a sound that seemed to Margaret louder than any gunshot she'd heard in the 6 days since they buried her husband. The rain kept falling. Margaret stood there in it, in the mud that had already ruined the only decent shoes she had left, and looked up and down the empty street of a town she'd lived in for 11 years. A town where she'd once hosted supper for half these same families, where she'd nursed sick children through fever and brought pies to funerals, and never once imagined that any of it had been building toward this, standing in the rain with a single carpet bag and nowhere on God's earth to lay her head. She thought briefly, wildly, of walking out past the edge of town into the dark and simply not stopping. The thought frightened her enough that she pushed it down hard, buried it the way she'd learned to bury most things this past week, and made herself walk instead toward the only other lit window she could see, the saloon. Though she had no earthly notion what she meant to do once she got there. Beg, work. She didn't know. She only knew standing still in the rain was its own kind of dying, slower than a bullet, but just as certain. She didn't make it halfway there. Well, look who it is. Frank Dobbs stepped out from the shadow of the mercantile awning with 2 other men trailing behind him, and Margaret's stomach dropped, the way it always dropped when she saw that particular look on a man's face. The look of someone who has decided somewhere along the way that another person's misfortune was an invitation rather than a tragedy. "Frank," she kept her voice steady through sheer force of will, "I don't want any trouble." "Ain't looking for trouble, Margaret. Just looking out for a neighbor." Frank's smile hadn't reached his eyes in the 11 years she'd known him, not once. "Heard your husband left you with nothing but debts and an empty house you can't even keep on account of the bank taking it Friday. Shame that. Man like Thomas thought he had more sense." "Get out of my way, Frank. Now that ain't neighborly talk." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on him, close enough that the 2 men behind him fanned out on either side of her, the way men do when they've decided without saying so out loud exactly how a thing is going to go. "I got a proposition for you, Margaret. Warm bed, hot meal. Man like me, I could see my way to helping a woman in your position. You understand my meaning. I understand it fine, and the answer's no. She tried to step around him. His hand closed on her arm, not gentle, not remotely gentle, and something cold and sick dropped through her chest. Wasn't asking, Frank said. And his grip tightened, and Margaret felt the full, terrible weight of exactly how alone a woman could be in a town that had decided collectively she was no longer worth protecting. Let go of her. The voice came from behind them, low, unhurried, carrying none of the panic Margaret felt roaring through her own chest, and every man on that street went still. Frank turned first, still gripping Margaret's arm, his face already curling into the sneer of a man who didn't like being interrupted. This ain't your business, stranger. Making it my business. A man stepped out of the rain and into the thin light spilling from the mercantile window, tall, broad, through the shoulders, hat pulled low against the weather. A duster coat soaked clean through and hanging heavy off a frame built for mountain work rather than town leisure. Margaret had never seen him before in her life. Nobody in Cedar Hollow had she'd have wagered, because a face like that sharp-jawed, weathered, carrying the particular stillness of a man who'd learned patience the hard way, was not a face this town would have forgotten easily. "Let go of the lady's arm," he said again, "or I'll help you let go of it myself, and I promise you won't care for my method." Frank's grip loosened just slightly. Uncertainty flickering across his face as he took the stranger's measure, the set of his shoulders, the low hang of a gun belt, half hidden beneath the duster. The flat, unblinking calm in eyes the color of riverstone. "Who in the hell are you?" "Nobody you need worry over long as you take your hand off her right now." For a long, taut moment, nobody moved, rain hammering down on the boardwalk. Margaret's heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought the men around her must surely hear it, and then Frank let go, shoved her arm away like it had burned him some old cowardice, winning out over whatever bravado the whiskey had been feeding him. "This ain't over," Frank muttered, though the words came out thinner than he probably intended. "It is tonight," the stranger said, and didn't move, didn't blink until Frank and his two companions had slunk back into the dark toward the saloon, muttering low to each other, throwing glances back over their shoulders that carried more humiliation than menace now. Margaret stood frozen where she was, rain running down her face, indistinguishable now from the tears she hadn't let herself shed all evening, and looked up at the stranger who'd stepped out of the storm to do what nobody else in this town, not a single soul who'd known her 11 years, had been willing to do. "Thank you." She managed, her voice barely above the sound of the rain. "Wasn't nothing." He touched two fingers to the brim of his hat, an old habit, courteous and automatic. "Ma'am, you're soaked clean through. You got somewhere to be tonight?" The question landed harder than he could have known, and Margaret felt the whole terrible weight of the evening crash back down on her. At once Ida's shut door, Frank's grip on her arm, the bank's notice pinned to what used to be her front gate, 6 days since she'd buried a husband who'd left her with nothing but shame and debt, and a town that had decided she was no longer worth the trouble of kindness. "No," she said, and the word broke something loose in her chest that she'd been holding together by sheer stubbornness since the funeral. "No, I don't. I have nowhere left to go." The stranger was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, which she'd had more than enough of this past week, but something steadier, something that looked almost like recognition, like a man who understood exactly what it cost a person to say those words out loud in the middle of a rainstorm to a total stranger. "Funny," he said finally, and something in his weathered face softened just slightly, just enough that Margaret caught the first true glimpse of the man beneath the wet coat and the low-hung gun. "I've got an empty house." Margaret stared at him, certain for one wild moment that she'd misheard him entirely, that the rain and the grief and the exhaustion had finally scrambled her mind past the point of trusting her own ears. "I'm sorry. Empty house," he said again, simple and unhurried, as though offering shelter to a grieving stranger in the middle of a storm was the most ordinary thing in the world to him. "Up in the hills above the ridgeline. Got more room than one man knows what to do with, and a roof that don't leak, and a stove that'll have this whole street's worth of chill out of your bones inside the hour. You're welcome to it, ma'am. No strings, No expectations, just a roof, till you've got a better plan than standing in the rain. You don't even know my name. Don't need to know it to know you don't deserve to be standing out here getting mauled by drunk men and turned away by a town that ought to be ashamed of itself. Something hardened briefly in his eyes, some old anger surfacing and receding just as fast. Name's Caleb Hart. I run cattle up past the Ridge Keep, mostly to myself, and I don't much care what this town thinks of me taking in a stranger tonight, on account of I stopped caring what this town thinks of me a long while back. Margaret searched his face for some sign of the trap. She half expected some flicker of the same hunger Frank had shown, some hidden cost to an offer that seemed on its face too plainly decent to be real, and found nothing there but quiet, patient honesty. The kind of stillness that comes from a man who has already weathered worse than whatever this town could throw at him, and simply stopped flinching from it. Why? She asked, echoing the same desperate question she'd have asked anyone tonight, needing some reason to hold on to before she let herself hope. Why would you help me? You don't know me. I could be anybody. I know what I saw, Caleb said. Woman standing alone in the rain being manhandled by men who ought to know better, turned away by a town too small-hearted to remember what decency looks like. Don't need to know your whole life story to know that's wrong, and I've got a house standing empty with nobody in it to fill the quiet. Seems like a plain enough trade to me, ma'am. My roof your company, no more complicated than that. Something in the word quiet caught in Margaret's chest, some undertone of old grief she recognized because she was drowning in the same thing herself, and she found herself studying him a moment longer, wondering what kind of loss left a man with an empty house and a willingness to fill it with strangers rather than keep it sealed shut against the world. I don't have anything to offer you, she said quietly. No money. No skills worth paying for. Just myself, and even that's not worth much these days judging by how this town's treated me. Didn't ask for payment. Caleb's jaw tightened, some flash of old fury at the words. This town's treated me passing plain across his weathered face before he mastered it. And ma'am, I'll tell you plain, a woman who stood in the rain and refused a man like Frank Dobbs, even when she'd every reason in the world to feel too broken to fight back. That's worth considerably more than this town seems capable of understanding. You come up to my place tonight, dry off, eat something warm, sleep somewhere safe. Tomorrow, you can decide whatever you want to decide. Tonight, you don't have to decide anything except whether you trust a stranger enough to get out of the rain. Margaret looked back once toward the shuttered windows of a town that had turned every door against her, toward Ida Fawcett's dark window, and the saloon's distant lamplight, where Frank Dobbs and his friends were no doubt already drowning their humiliation in whiskey, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the funeral finally fractionally began to loosen. All right, she said, and the words came out steadier than she felt, steadier than she had any right to feel after a week like the one she'd just survived. All right, Mr. Hart. I'll trust you tonight. Caleb, he said, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Man doesn't stand to make you a promise like this, and then let you call him Mr. Ma'am. Margaret, she said. Margaret Ellis. Well, Margaret Ellis. He shifted the weight of a saddlebag she hadn't noticed him carrying, and gestured with a tilt of his head toward the dark road leading up out of town, toward hills she could just barely make out through the rain, black shapes against a blacker sky. Horses tied up 2 streets over. It's a fair ride and the weather's not kind, but I promise you, it's a good deal kinder than another hour standing in this street. He didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her, didn't do a single thing that might have made a woman already raw with grief and fear feel cornered. He simply stood there, patient as stone, and waited for her to decide on her own, whether to follow him into the dark toward a stranger's empty house, or turn back toward a town that had already shown her exactly what it thought she was worth. Margaret picked up her ruined carpetbag, tightened her grip on the one possession she had left in the world, and followed him. Behind her, Cedar Hollow's lamplit windows shrank smaller and smaller into the rain, and ahead of her, somewhere up past the dark ridgeline, a house stood waiting. That she knew nothing about, belonging to a man she'd known less than 10 minutes, and yet walking beside him through the storm. Margaret Ellis felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt for the first time in 6 terrible days something that might cautiously, carefully have been called safe. The ride up out of Cedar Hollow took the better part of an hour, Rain never once letting up, and Margaret spent most of it gripping the saddle horn, with hands gone numb, from cold too exhausted and too raw to make conversation. Grateful that Caleb Hart seemed to understand without her needing to explain it, that silence was its own kind of mercy after a night like the one she'd just survived. It was only when the black shape of a house finally rose up out of the dark windows, unlit a barn standing silent beside it, that Margaret felt her exhaustion crack enough to let a single question through. "You live here alone?" Caleb was quiet a beat too long before answering, swinging down off his horse and reaching up to help her down with a steadiness that asked nothing of her in return. "Now I do," he said. "Wasn't always so." Something in the flatness of it told her not to push further, not tonight, and she let it go, following him up onto a porch that creaked familiar beneath her feet, into a house that smelled of wood smoke and leather, and the particular staleness of rooms that didn't see much daily use. He lit a lamp and the gold light spilled across a front room that surprised her, clean, orderly, but sparse in a way that spoke plainly of a man living smaller than the space he occupied, as though he'd shut half the house up in his mind, even if the walls themselves remained standing. "Kitchen's through there," Caleb said, already crossing to the stove, feeding kindling into it with the quick, practiced movements of a man who'd built 1,000 fires alone. "I'll get this going, get some heat in the place. There's a room at the end of the hall. Second door was my sister's before she married and moved on to her own place 2 counties over. Bed's made. Ought to be comfortable enough." "Caleb." Margaret stood dripping in his front room carpetbag still clutched in one hand, and found herself needing to say the thing before exhaustion swallowed her courage entirely. "I don't know how to thank you for this. I mean that plainly. You didn't have to stop tonight. You didn't have to do any of this. Man who walks past a woman in trouble because it's inconvenient to stop," Caleb said, not looking up from the stove. "Isn't much of a man way I was raised to think of it." He struck a match, and firelight caught the hard-weathered planes of his face, and for just a moment Margaret saw something pass behind his eyes that looked less like kindness and more like old private grief finding a use for itself at last. "Get yourself dry, Margaret. Questions can wait till morning. Tonight you just need to rest." She didn't argue. She was too tired to argue, too hollowed out by a week of burying a husband and being turned away by every door in a town she'd called home for 11 years. And she let him show her to the small back room. And she lay down on a bed that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. And for the first time in 6 nights, sleep took her fast and deep and mercifully empty of dreams. Dead. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon gray morning light slanting through a window she hadn't properly seen the night before. And for one disoriented moment, she forgot entirely where she was. Forgot the funeral, forgot Ida's shut door, forgot everything except the simple animal comfort of waking up warm and dry and unafraid. Then it all came rushing back, and she sat up fast, heart hammering, and made herself breathe through it the way she'd been teaching herself to do all week. She found Caleb in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, moving around a stove that was clearly more familiar to him than most men's stoves were to them. And he glanced up when she appeared in the doorway, with an expression careful enough that she understood he'd been bracing too for whatever this morning might bring. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's hot. Eggs'll be ready shortly if you can stomach them. You didn't have to cook for me. Woman's got to eat." He set a plate down at the small table, gestured for her to sit, and Margaret found herself obeying, without quite deciding, to some old habit of politeness, reasserting itself even now. "Sleep all right." "Better than I have in a week." She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug he set in front of her, grateful for the heat of it. "Caleb, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "All right. What do you want from me? Really?" She made herself meet his eyes, refusing to look away, even though the question cost her something to ask. "I've been a wife for 11 years and a widow for 6 days, and I have learned this past week that men rarely do kindness without expecting something back eventually. So I'm asking now plainly, so there's no confusion later. What is it you want?" Caleb didn't flinch from the question, didn't get angry, didn't do any of the things she'd half-braced herself for. He simply set down the pan he was holding, leaned back against the counter, and looked at her with an expression of such quiet, unguarded honesty that it startled her more than anger would have. "I want nothing from you, Margaret Ellis, except maybe the chance to prove that not every man in this territory is cut from the same cloth as the ones who turned you out last night." He crossed his arms, old weariness surfacing plain in his weathered face. "I lost my wife 3 years back. Fever took her quicker than I could get a doctor up from town. This house has been sitting empty and too quiet ever since, and I've mostly made my peace with that, on account of there wasn't much else to do about it. But last night, I watched a woman standing alone in the rain, being manhandled by men who ought to have known better, turned away by a whole town too small and too cowardly to remember what decency looks like, and something in me just wasn't willing to walk past that. Wasn't about wanting something from you. Was about not wanting to be the kind of man who could have helped and didn't." Margaret sat with that for a long moment, feeling something in her chest crack open that she'd been holding rigid since the funeral. Not just gratitude, but something closer to recognition. The plain understanding that grief did not always harden a person into cruelty, that sometimes it carved out room instead, room enough to let a stranger in. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said quietly. "I'm sorry about your husband," Caleb said. "Though I suspect from what little I gathered last night, you might not be grieving him quite the way this town expects you to." Margaret felt her jaw tighten, old shame and old anger rising together. Thomas gambled away everything. She said the words coming out flatter than she intended, worn smooth by a week of having to say them over and over to bankers and neighbors and anyone else who demanded an accounting. Cattle money that wasn't his to gamble. "Half this valley's savings if the whispers are true, though nobody said so to my face outright. He put a bullet in his own head 6 days ago rather than face what he'd done and left me to face it instead." Her hands tightened around the coffee mug. "So, no, Caleb. I'm not grieving him the way this town expects. I'm angry. I'm angry at a dead man who left me with nothing but his debts and his shame, and angrier still at a town that decided the moment he was in the ground that I was somehow guilty of his sins simply for having married him." "That's not fair," Caleb said quietly. "None of that is fair to you." "No," Margaret agreed. "It isn't. But fair's a luxury this valley doesn't seem to extend to widows with empty pockets." They sat with that a moment, the fire-crackling rain still tapping soft against the windows. And Margaret found herself studying this stranger, who'd pulled her out of the rain. The careful way he held himself like a man accustomed to bracing against blows that never quite stopped coming. The old grief still sitting fresh enough behind his eyes that she recognized it as a mirror of her own. "Can I ask you something else?" she said finally. "You've asked me plenty already this morning. Might as well keep going. Why does this town let a man like Frank Dobbs walk free, doing what he tried to do to me last night, and yet turn a widow out into the rain for the crime of her husband's debts?" The question had been sitting in her chest since the moment Ida's door shut, and she needed to ask it out loud, needed to hear whether Caleb's answer would confirm what she already suspected. "That's not simple cruelty, is it? That's something more deliberate." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, careful calculating a man deciding how much truth to hand a stranger he'd known less than 12 hours. "Frank Dobbs works for a man named Silas Kane," he said slowly. "Kane owns the bank in Cedar Hollow, owns most of the good grazing land in this valley besides, and has spent the better part of 10 years buying up whatever land he can get his hands on, one way or another. Your husband's debts. Margaret, I'd wager good money Kane had a hand in encouraging them one way or another. Man doesn't get as rich as Silas Kane by simple luck. He gets rich by making sure other men fail, and then being conveniently positioned to buy up the wreckage." Margaret's stomach turned cold. "You think Thomas's gambling wasn't entirely his own doing?" "I think," Caleb said carefully, "that a lot of ruined men in this valley these past few years have found their way to ruin through card games that seemed afterward awfully convenient for a certain banker's landholdings. I've got no proof of it. Just a bad feeling I've been carrying a long while, and no way yet to prove it's more than suspicion." The words landed in Margaret's chest like a struck match. Old grief and old confusion, suddenly catching fire into something sharper, something that felt for the first time in 6 days. Less like helpless mourning and more like the first stirrings of fury with somewhere useful to go. "The bank's taking my house Friday," she said slowly. "The house Thomas and I built together 11 years of my life, and they're taking it Friday on account of debts I never once knew existed until the week after he died." She set the coffee mug down, hands trembling now with something other than cold. "If what you're saying is true, Caleb, if Silas Kane had any hand at all in driving my husband to those card tables, then that man isn't just profiting from my ruin, he's the architect of it." "I can't prove that," Caleb said again, more careful now, watching her reaction with something like concern. "I don't want to hand you a theory that sends you charging into town making accusations you can't back up. That's a fast way to get yourself hurt worse than you already have been." "Then help me find proof," Margaret said, and heard the fire in her own voice, steady now, in a way it hadn't been since before the funeral. "You clearly already suspect something, Caleb. You've been carrying this suspicion a long while, you said so yourself. Why haven't you done anything about it?" Caleb was quiet a long moment, old frustration surfacing plain across his weathered face. "Because I'm one man with cattle to run and no proof going up against a banker with the whole territory's law and money bent to his favor, and every time I've poked at it before, I've come away with nothing but Kane's men, making my life harder for the trouble." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. Some old weariness there that spoke of battles already fought and lost. "You want the honest truth. I stopped pushing at it about a year back after Kane's men ran off half my herd one dark night and left me a message plain enough not to need translating. I've got nobody left in this world to protect but myself. Margaret and I made my peace with letting Kane have his valley, so long as he left me and my cattle alone up here on the ridge. And now," Margaret asked quietly, "now that you've pulled a stranger out of the rain who might have a reason to fight him?" Something shifted in Caleb's face, old resignation cracking under the weight of a new possibility. "Now," he said slowly, "I suppose I've got to decide whether I'm willing to risk what little peace I've built for myself on the chance that helping you might finally do some good in this valley, instead of just costing me more than I've already lost." The knock came at the door not 20 minutes later, hard and urgent, and Margaret felt her whole body go tense at the sound, some animal instinct from the past week telling her that knocks like that rarely brought good news. Caleb crossed to the door with his hand resting casual but deliberate near the gun belt hanging by the frame, and opened it to find a young man standing on the porch, hat in hand, rain-soaked and out of breath like he'd ridden hard to get there. "Mr. Hart?" The young man's eyes cut past. Caleb found Margaret standing in the kitchen doorway, and something like relief crossed his face. "Mrs. Ellis, thank God. I've been looking for you since sunup." "Danny!" Margaret came forward, recognizing him now. Danny Whitfield, the bank clerk's son, a boy she'd known since he was small enough to sit on her porch steps eating pie after Sunday service. "What's wrong?" "It's my pa," Danny said, twisting his hat in his hands. "He's been working the books at the bank all week on account of Mr. Kane wanting everything squared away before Friday's foreclosure, and Mrs. Ellis, he found something. Something about your husband's debts that don't sit right with him. Numbers that don't add up the way they oughta, entries that look like they was changed after the fact." He glanced nervously toward Caleb, then back to Margaret. "He sent me to find you on account of he's afraid to say anything himself, afraid of what Mr. Kane might do if he finds out my pa's been asking questions. But he said you deserve to know the truth, whatever it costs him." Margaret's heart slammed hard against her ribs, the theory Caleb had only just voiced, suddenly terrifyingly taking solid shape. "What kind of numbers, Danny?" "I don't rightly know all of it," Danny admitted. "I'm not good with figures the way my pa is. But he said your husband's original loan was near half what the bank's now claiming you owe. And there's entries added after in a different hand dated for card debts nobody around town ever actually saw your husband lose at. My pa thinks somebody's been cooking the books, Mrs. Ellis, making it look like your husband owed a lot more than he ever really did, so the bank could take the house outright instead of just collecting what was actually owed." The kitchen went very quiet, rain drumming steady against the roof, and Margaret felt the whole shape of the past 6 days rearrange itself violently in her mind. Not simply a husband's shameful weakness, not simply her own bad luck, but something deliberate. Something engineered by a man with enough money and enough patience to manufacture a widow's ruin for the sake of a piece of land he wanted. "Where's your father now?" Caleb asked, his voice gone hard and focused in a way Margaret hadn't heard from him yet. "Still at the bank. Told me to find Mrs. Ellis quiet-like, not make a fuss on account of if Mr. Kane finds out he's been going through the old ledgers." Danny's voice cracked with genuine fear. "Mr. Hart, my pa's scared. Real scared. Kane already ran off 2 other clerks these past years for asking too many questions, and one of them nobody's heard from since. My pa's got a wife and 4 kids to think of. He wants to help Mrs. Ellis, but he's terrified of what it'll cost him if Kane finds out." Margaret felt sick with the weight of it, not just her own ruin now, but the understanding that an honest man's family might be in danger simply for uncovering the truth of what had been done to her. "Tell your father I understand," she said carefully. "And I won't ask him to risk more than he's already risked by sending you. But Danny, I need proof. If there's altered entries in that ledger, I need something I can actually hold in my hand and show a judge, or none of this changes anything come Friday." Danny nodded, still pale, still frightened, but something steadier settling into his young face. "My pa said the same thing, actually. Said if you're willing to meet him tonight after the bank closes, he thinks he can get you copies of the pages that don't match up. Said to come to the back of the bank after dark quiet as you can manage. We'll be there," Caleb said, before Margaret could even fully process the invitation, and something in the firmness of it settled a measure of the fear building in her chest. Danny left as quickly as he'd come, riding hard back down toward town through rain that showed no sign of letting up, and Margaret stood in Caleb's kitchen with her heart still hammering, the fragile hope of proof warring hard against the fresh, sharp fear of exactly what a man like Silas Kane might do if he discovered what was being uncovered right under his nose. "This is dangerous," she said quietly. "You heard what Danny said. Kane's already made people disappear for less." "I heard." Caleb's jaw was set hard old caution and new resolve visibly warring in his expression. "But Margaret, I'll tell you plain. I've spent a year telling myself it wasn't my fight, that keeping my head down and protecting what little I had left was the smarter path. And maybe it was for a man with nobody left to lose." He looked at her something fierce and decided, settling behind his gray eyes. "But you walked into my life last night with nothing but a carpetbag and a town's worth of cruelty at your back, and I find I'm not much interested in standing by and doing nothing a second time. Not when doing nothing means watching a man like Kane get away with ruining a good woman's life, on top of everything else he's already stolen from this valley." Yamai. Something in Margaret's chest loosened at that gratitude and fear, and something warmer, something she didn't have room yet to fully name, tangling together as she looked at this stranger, who'd become in the span of a single night the only ally she had left in the world. "Then we go tonight," she said. "And Caleb, thank you for not walking past." "Told you already." He said something almost gentle in his weathered face despite the hard set of his jaw. Not much of a man who could. "Boo!" The day passed slow and tense, both of them too keyed up to do much beyond wait. Caleb tending to chores around the ranch with restless, distracted energy, while Margaret sat by the window watching rain streak the glass, running the numbers Danny had described over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of a betrayal that seemed the longer she turned it over both monstrous and entirely coldly plausible. By late afternoon, a second visitor arrived, this one far less welcome. Margaret heard the horses first, more than one rider, and looked up to see Caleb already moving toward the window, his whole body gone taut and alert, in a way that told her before she even saw the men dismounting in the yard, exactly who had come calling. "That's Kane," Caleb said quietly. "And it's not a social visit." Margaret's stomach dropped as she watched through the rain-streaked glass, 3 men swinging down off their horses. One of them unmistakably in charge, dressed finer than the others, in a dark coat that stayed remarkably clean despite the weather, his face carrying the particular smooth confidence of a man who had never once in his whole life been told no and made it stick. "Stay back from the window," Caleb said, already moving toward the door, checking the gun at his hip with quick, practiced hands. "Whatever happens, Margaret let me do the talking." "Caleb, please." His eyes found hers steady despite the tension radiating off him. "I need you safe more than I need you brave right now. Just this once." She stepped back from the window, heart hammering, and watched through the gap in the curtain as Caleb stepped out onto the porch to meet the man who had, if Danny's father was right, orchestrated the ruin of everything Margaret Ellis had ever built. Caleb Hart. Silas Kane's voice carried easy across the yard, pleasant on its surface in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl even through the closed door. "Didn't expect to find you playing host to Cedar Hollow's most talked-about widow. Whole town's buzzing about it, matter of fact you riding off with Margaret Ellis right under everyone's noses. Don't recall inviting your opinion on my house guests, Kane. Wasn't asking for permission to have one." Kane's smile didn't waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes. "I'm here on a matter of business, actually. Words reached me that certain parties around town have been asking questions they oughtn't be asking about certain ledgers that are frankly none of their concern." His gaze flicked toward the house, toward the window Margaret stood just behind, and she felt her whole body go cold under the weight of that look. "I'd hate for Mrs. Ellis to go stirring up trouble that only makes her situation harder than it already is. Foreclosure's set for Friday regardless. No sense making enemies of people who might, under other circumstances, have shown her some mercy." "That sounds an awful lot like a threat," Caleb said, his voice gone flat and dangerous. "Just neighborly advice," Kane said, though the smile had thinned considerably now. "Same advice I'd give any man foolish enough to go poking around in business that could get him hurt worse than a little lost grazing land. You remember what happened to your herd last year, Hart. Wouldn't want a repeat of that kind of misfortune, not for you, and certainly not for a woman already carrying more grief than she can rightly handle." Margaret felt fury rise hot and sharp in her chest, listening to a man threaten the only two people who'd shown her kindness in the past 6 days, and before she could stop herself, before Caleb's warning could hold her back, she was crossing to the door and pulling it open. "You," she said, stepping out onto the porch despite the rain. Despite every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden. "Have some nerve riding up here to threaten decent people on top of everything else you've already stolen from me." "Mrs. Ellis." Kane's smile turned oily, patronizing. "I don't know what wild stories you've been fed, but I'd be careful throwing accusations at a man who's shown you nothing but patience regarding a debt your husband, a debt you manufactured." Margaret said the words tearing loose before caution could stop them, fury burning hotter than fear now. "I know what you did, Kane. I know about the altered ledgers. I know my husband's original debt was half what you're now claiming, and I know exactly what kind of man builds his fortune on other people's manufactured ruin." Silas Kane's smile vanished entirely, something cold and dangerous surfacing in its place. And for one long, terrible moment, nobody on that porch moved at all. Rain falling steady around them, the whole confrontation balanced on a knife's edge that Margaret understood too late she had just pushed dangerously close to breaking. "That," Kane said quietly, all pleasantness gone from his voice now, "is a very serious accusation to make against a man with my resources, Mrs. Ellis. I'd think very carefully before you make it again in front of witnesses who matter." "I intend to make it in front of a judge," Margaret said, refusing to let her voice shake, despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "With proof." Something flickered across Kane's face. Surprise quickly masked, but not quickly enough to hide entirely, and Margaret understood watching it that she had just revealed far more than she should have, far sooner than she should have to a man who now knew with absolute certainty that his carefully hidden fraud was no longer safely buried. "Proof," Kane repeated softly, and his eyes cut briefly toward town, toward the bank, toward a clerk's family that Margaret suddenly sickeningly understood was now in far graver danger than any of them had reckoned on. He turned back to his horse without another word mounted, and looked down at Caleb and Margaret, both with an expression gone entirely coldly calm, now all pretense of neighborly patience stripped away. "Friday," he said, The foreclosure stands regardless of whatever fantasies you've been fed, Mrs. Ellis. And Hart, I'd think very carefully about which fights you choose to make your own going forward. Some debts get called in a great deal faster than others. He rode off through the rain with his 2 men trailing behind, and Margaret stood on the porch, shaking not entirely from cold, watching the shapes of them disappear down toward town, toward a bank clerk's family who had no earthly idea yet exactly what danger Margaret's careless fury had just brought crashing down toward their door. "We need to warn Danny's father," she said, turning to Caleb, panic rising fast now that the confrontation's heat had drained away and left only consequence behind. "Right now, Caleb, before Kane gets to him first." Caleb was already moving toward the barn, already saddling his horse with hands gone fast and grim. "Then we ride now," he said. "And Margaret, I hope to God we're not already too late." They rode hard through the rain, Margaret clinging to the saddle behind Caleb with her arms locked tight around his waist, and the whole ride down toward town felt to her like a held breath that refused to break, every mile stretching too long, every minute feeling like it might already be 1 minute too late. "If Kane gets to him first," she started. "Don't," Caleb said, not unkindly but firm. "Don't spend what's left of this ride on what might already be done. Spend it getting there." They came into Cedar Hollow from the back roads, avoiding Main Street on Caleb's insistence, and dismounted 2 streets over from the bank in the deepening dusk, moving fast and low toward the alley behind the building, where Danny had said his father would be waiting. They found Danny first, crouched behind a rain barrel, white-faced and shaking. "Danny?" Margaret dropped to his level, gripping his shoulders. "Where's your father?" "He's inside," Danny whispered. "Kane's men came about 20 minutes ago. I heard shouting. My pa told me to run, told me to hide, and I didn't want to leave him, but he made me—" The boy's voice cracked entirely, tears cutting through the rain on his face. "Mrs. Ellis, I think they're hurting him." Caleb was already moving toward the back door of the bank, gun drawn now, his whole body gone hard and focused in a way that left no room for hesitation. "Stay here with Margaret," he told Danny. "Both of you stay hidden. I mean it." "I'm not staying here while you walk in there alone," Margaret said. "Margaret." "He's scared for his family because of what I said on that porch," she said, fierce and unmovable. "I'm not hiding in an alley while a good man pays for my mistake. I'm coming." Caleb looked at her for one taut second. Some old instinct to protect Waring visibly, with the understanding that she wasn't going to be talked out of it, and finally gave a short, sharp nod. "Stay behind me. Whatever you see in there, stay behind me." The back door was unlocked, swinging loose on its hinges, and they moved through it into a narrow hallway lit by a single lamp. Voices carrying low and urgent from the front office. Kane's voice cold and controlled, and beneath it, a second voice, older, frightened, pleading. "Already told you, Mr. Kane. I haven't shown anyone anything. I was only looking through the old files for the audit you asked for. Don't lie to me, Whitfield. My man saw your boy riding out toward Hart's ranch this morning. Same morning Margaret Ellis suddenly knows details about ledger entries she had no earthly way of knowing unless somebody handed them to her." Caleb reached the office doorway first and stopped Margaret with a raised hand, peering through the gap before pushing the door open fully, gun already leveled. "That's enough, Kane." The scene inside stopped Margaret's heart cold. Danny's father, Elias Whitfield, sitting in a chair with a split lip and one eye already swelling shut, one of Kane's men standing over him with a fist still raised, and Silas Kane himself standing near the desk with an expression of perfect unbothered calm, as though a beaten clerk in his own bank office were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Caleb Hart," Kane said, not even turning fully around, "you have a bad habit of interrupting private business meetings. Get away from him." Caleb's voice carried a flatness Margaret hadn't heard from him yet, something dangerous and absolutely serious. "Now Kane or I put a bullet in the first man who so much as breathes wrong." The man standing over Whitfield froze, hand still raised, glancing toward Kane for direction, with the particular hesitation of hired muscle, suddenly uncertain whether the money was worth the risk. "You're making a very serious mistake," Kane said, turning now, his composure still intact, but something colder moving behind his eyes. Drawing a gun on me in my own establishment in front of witnesses? Witnesses to you beating an innocent man for the crime of doing honest bookkeeping," Margaret said, stepping fully into the room now despite Caleb's earlier warning, unable to hold herself back at the sight of Danny's father bleeding in that chair. "I'll make sure every soul in this valley knows exactly what kind of man you are, Silas Kane." "Margaret!" Elias Whitfield's voice came out thin and strained, though something like relief broke through the fear in his one good eye at the sight of her. "You shouldn't have come. It's too dangerous. You sent your son to warn me at real risk to yourself," Margaret said, crossing to him, despite the tension still coiled thick in the room. "And I wasn't about to leave you to face that risk alone." "Touching," Kane said dryly, "but entirely beside the point. Mr. Whitfield here has been engaging in serious misconduct, accessing confidential bank records without authorization, spreading false accusations about the bank's practices." "False," Elias said, and something steadier entered his battered voice now, some old professional pride refusing to bend even under fresh bruises. "The entries are false, Kane, and you know it plain as I do. Margaret Ellis's original note was for $400. The ledger now shows $1,100 with card debt entries added in a hand that doesn't match your own bookkeeping. Dated for dates when half this town can vouch. Her husband was homesick with fever, not anywhere near a card table." The room went very still, the accusation landing plain and irrefutable, in a way that even Kane's careful composure couldn't fully absorb. "That's a serious allegation," Kane said finally, "from a man who's about to lose his position at this bank for gross misconduct." "It's the truth," Elias said. "And I've got the original pages hidden somewhere. You'll never find them. Kane copied in my own hand before your man came busting in here tonight. So you can beat me black and blue if it suits you, but it won't change what's already written down and already safely out of your reach." Something dangerous flickered across Kane's face. Real fury finally cracking through the smooth veneer he'd maintained through the whole confrontation, and for one terrible moment, Margaret thought he might order his man to strike Elias again, regardless of the gun leveled at his chest. "Where are they?" Kane said, low and cold. "Somewhere safe," Elias said. "And they'll stay that way so long as my family's left alone starting tonight." Kane's jaw worked, calculation visible behind his eyes. A man rapidly recalculating a situation that had spun considerably further from his control than he'd anticipated when he'd sent men to intimidate a frightened clerk into silence. "This isn't finished," he said, finally addressing the whole room. Now his composure reasserting itself through sheer force of will, even as fury still burned plain beneath it. "You've made a grave error tonight, all of you. I have resources none of you can begin to match, and I promise you before this is through, every one of you will understand exactly what it costs to cross me. Get out," Caleb said, gun still steady. "Before I decide the sheriff needs to hear about assault charges tonight instead of tomorrow." Kane's man helped him gather himself with visible reluctance, and the two of them left through the front of the bank without another word. Though the look Kane threw back over his shoulder as he went carried a promise of retribution that chilled Margaret far more than anything he'd said aloud. The moment the door shut behind them, Margaret dropped to her knees beside Elias's chair, gently examining the damage to his face, with hands that shook now that the immediate danger had passed. "We need to get you to a doctor. I'll be all right," Elias said, though his voice carried a tremor that suggested otherwise. "Won't be the first bruise I've earned defending what's right, and I doubt it'll be the last way this valley's run." He caught Margaret's hand, gripping it with sudden urgency despite his pain. "Margaret, listen to me. Those pages I copied, they're proof enough to bring before a judge, but Kane's not going to sit idle waiting for that to happen. He knows now that we've got something on him. He's going to move fast, try to bury this however he can, maybe even try to get to the judge before we do. Then we move faster," Caleb said. "Where's the nearest circuit judge?" "Prescott Junction," Elias said. 2 days' ride, maybe less if the weather breaks. Judge Harlan Tate rides that circuit man's got a reputation for being straight as an arrow, not the kind Kane can easily buy off, not like some of the closer magistrates. 2 days, Margaret repeated, feeling the weight of the timeline crash down on her fresh. Caleb, the foreclosure is Friday. That's 3 days from now. Then we ride tonight, Caleb said, already moving. And we ride hard, and we pray the weather holds enough to make the trip in time. Yimt. They left within the hour after making certain Elias Whitfield and his family were safely hidden at a neighbor's house, rather than left exposed at their own. The copied ledger pages secured deep in Caleb's saddlebag, wrapped tight against the rain that showed no sign of relenting. The 2 days that followed passed in a blur of exhaustion and urgency. Margaret and Caleb pushing their horses hard through country that grew rougher the further they traveled from Cedar Hollow, stopping only when the animals themselves demanded it. Sleeping in short, uneasy shifts beneath makeshift shelter. Every hour weighted with the knowledge that Silas Kane was not a man who would simply wait patiently for justice to catch up with him. It was on the second night, huddled close to a small fire Caleb had coaxed to life, despite the damp, that Margaret finally found the courage to ask the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest since the confrontation in the bank office. "You could have stayed out of this," she said quietly, watching firelight flicker across his tired, weathered face. "Kane threatened you plainly back at your ranch, threatened your herd same as before, and still you rode straight into that bank with a gun drawn for a woman you'd known less than a day." Caleb was quiet a long moment, staring into the fire. "My wife," he said finally. "The year before she died, she asked me once why I never spoke up when Kane started buying out the smaller ranchers, one after another, always through debts that seemed to appear out of nowhere, right when a man was already struggling. I told her it wasn't my business, told her a man's got to pick his battles careful in a territory run by money like Kane's." He shook his head slowly, old regret plain in his voice. "She died a few months later, and I never got the chance to tell her she was right to be disappointed in that answer. Been carrying that regret a long while now, Margaret. Longer than I probably let on. And now I figure I'm done watching good people get ground down by a man who's never once had to answer for what he's done." He looked up at her firelight, catching something steady and certain in his gray eyes. "You walked into my life needing shelter from the rain, but somewhere along the way these past 2 days, I think you've given me back something I'd lost a good while before you ever showed up the nerve to stand up and fight for what's right, even when it costs something." Margaret felt something warm move through her chest despite the cold, damp night around them. Some feeling she hadn't let herself examine too closely, yet too raw and too recent to fully trust, after everything the past week had cost her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for all of it. I don't know what I'd have done without you these past 2 days, Caleb. I don't know what I'd have done at all if you'd walked past me that first night. Wasn't in me to walk past," he said simply, and something in the plain honesty of it settled deep in her chest, steady as a held hand. They reached Prescott Junction late the following afternoon, exhausted and travel-worn, and found Judge Harlan Tate exactly where Elias had promised he'd be, a stern, silver-haired man in his 60s, who listened to their account with careful, measured attention, examining the copied ledger pages with the meticulous eye of a man who'd seen every variety of fraud a territory this size could produce. "This is compelling evidence," Judge Tate said, finally setting the pages down. "Altered entries, dates that contradict witness accounts. A pattern that, if it holds under scrutiny, suggests deliberate fraud rather than simple bookkeeping error. But Mrs. Ellis, I have to ask you plainly, are you prepared for what pursuing this formally will cost you? Silas Kane is not a man without resources or without allies in this territory. This will not be a quick or a gentle fight. I've already lost my husband, my house, and nearly my dignity to this man's schemes," Margaret said, steady, despite the exhaustion weighing heavy on her. "I don't have much left for him to threaten, Judge Tate, except perhaps my life, and I find I'm no longer willing to hand him even that without a fight." Judge Tate studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his weathered face. "Then I'll issue an emergency injunction, effective immediately, halting the foreclosure on your property pending a full investigation into these allegations. I'll also dispatch a formal order for territorial marshals to investigate Silas Kane's banking practices directly, given the severity of what you've brought before me today." He began drawing up the paperwork with brisk efficiency. "But I want you both to understand, an injunction on paper doesn't stop a man like Cain from acting outside the law in the meantime. You'd be wise to watch your backs closely until marshals can get boots on the ground in Cedar Hollow. They rode back toward Cedar Hollow the next morning, the signed injunction secured carefully alongside the ledger pages, exhaustion warring with fragile hard-won hope, and it was less than an hour outside town that the hope curdled sharply into fresh dread. Smoke rose thin and dark against the horizon exactly in the direction of Caleb's ranch. "No!" Caleb breathed and spurred his horse into a dead run before Margaret could even fully process what she was seeing, her own heart slamming with terror as she urged her mount to follow. They crested the last ridge to find the barn engulfed flames, climbing high and furious against the gray afternoon sky. Cattle scattered and panicked across the yard, and no sign in that first terrible moment of another living soul anywhere near the blaze. Caleb was off his horse before it had fully stopped sprinting toward the burning barn, with a desperation that tore straight through Margaret's chest, and she screamed his name into the smoke and heat without even deciding to. "Caleb, wait. My horses are still in there." He was already at the barn door, hauling it open, despite flame licking up the frame, smoke pouring out thick and black, and Margaret's heart seized as she watched him disappear into it. "Caleb." She swung down off her own horse, running toward the barn with no plan beyond the animal terror of not losing him too, and had nearly reached the door when he stumbled back out, coughing hard, leading two terrified, whinnying horses by their halters. His shirt scorched at one shoulder, soot streaked black across his face. "There's more!" he gasped, shoving the lead ropes into Margaret's hands. "Two more stalls back corner. You can't go back in there, it's coming down." "I have to try." And he was gone again before she could stop him back into the smoke and roaring heat, and Margaret stood frozen with two panicked horses fighting the ropes in her hands, watching the barn's roof begin to sag dangerously inward, screaming his name into smoke that swallowed the sound whole. The seconds stretched into something unbearable. Flame climbing higher, timber groaning and cracking somewhere deep inside the structure, and just when Margaret's terror had climbed to something almost unbearable, Caleb burst back out through the smoke, leading two more horses, himself coughing violently, staggering the last several yards before collapsing to his knees in the yard. Behind him, with a groan of tortured timber, the barn roof caved in entirely, sending a fresh column of sparks and smoke roaring skyward. Margaret dropped the lead ropes and ran to him, falling to her knees in the mud beside him, hands frantic on his shoulders, his face checking for burns, for injury, for anything that might explain the way he was still coughing, still gasping. "You could have died," she said, voice breaking entirely now, all the careful composure of the past 2 days shattering at once. "Caleb, you could have died in there. Horses would have burned alive," he managed between coughs, "if I hadn't. I don't care about the horses." The words tore out of her louder than she intended, raw and unguarded, and she gripped his face in both hands, forcing him to look at her. "I care about you. Do you understand that I have already lost too much this week to lose you too?" Something in his smoke-reddened eyes softened at that some understanding passing between them that neither of them had quite spoken aloud yet, and for a moment, kneeling together in the mud with his barn collapsing in flame behind them, the whole terrible danger of the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, and the fragile, undeniable thing growing between them, despite everything trying to burn it down. "I'm all right," he said finally, voice rough from smoke. "Margaret, I'm all right." She helped him to his feet, and together they surveyed the wreckage. The barn a total loss. Smoke still pouring skyward. Cattle scattered wide across the surrounding hills in their panic, and no sign anywhere of who might have set the fire, though neither of them needed to voice the suspicion sitting heavy and obvious between them. "Cain," Margaret said quietly. "Cain." Caleb agreed, his voice gone hard and flat, all the earlier tenderness replaced now with cold, focused fury. "Message plain enough. Same thing he did to my herd a year back, except this time he means it as more than a warning. This time he means to ruin me outright, before that injunction of yours can do him any harm. We need to find who did this. We need proof, same as we did for the ledgers." "Margaret." Caleb caught her arm, turned her to face him, fully urgency plain in his soot-streaked face. There isn't time for chasing proof on this one. Kane's already shown us tonight he's done playing careful. That injunction we're carrying makes him desperate, and desperate men do worse than burn a barn. His grip tightened slightly. I need you to listen to me. Once marshals arrive to serve that injunction, Kane loses everything, his bank likely his freedom besides, given what those ledgers prove. A man facing that kind of ruin isn't going to sit quiet and wait for justice to catch up with him. He's going to come at us direct and soon. The words landed in Margaret's chest with the particular cold clarity of a truth she'd been avoiding since the moment she'd seen smoke rising over the ridge. Then what do? We get that injunction served tonight, Caleb said. Not tomorrow, tonight. Sheriff's office in town get a deputy out to Kane's place before he's got time to do anything worse than burn a barn. They rode into Cedar Hollow as dusk fell, thick and gray, exhausted, soot-stained, and found the sheriff's office lit and mercifully occupied. Sheriff Cole Pruitt. A broad, unhurried man Margaret had known peripherally for years, looked up from his desk with visible alarm at the state of them both. Lord Almighty, what happened to you two? Kane burned my barn, Caleb said without preamble, dropping the signed injunction on the sheriff's desk. And there's an emergency injunction from Judge Tate in Prescott Junction, halting the foreclosure on Margaret's property and ordering a formal investigation into Kane's banking practices. I need you to serve it tonight, Cole. Not tomorrow morning. Tonight. Sheriff Pruitt read through the document slowly, his broad face growing increasingly grim with each line. This is serious business, he said finally. Fraud allegations against Silas Kane. You understand what you're accusing him of here? We understand it plainly, Margaret said. We've got copied ledger pages proving it Elias Whitfield's testimony, and now a burned barn that happened less than an hour after we left Prescott Junction with this injunction in hand. If that's not enough to convince you Kane's dangerous and desperate sheriff, I don't know what more you're waiting for. Pruitt studied the two of them a long moment, some old calculation visible behind his eyes. A lawman in a small territory town, weighing the cost of crossing the valley's wealthiest, most powerful citizen against the plain evidence sitting on his desk. I'll ride out there tonight, he said finally. Take my deputy with me. But Margaret... His gaze softened slightly. I want you both to understand, this isn't going to end quiet. Kane's not a man who'll take being served papers lying down, especially not papers that could see him facing serious federal charges over banking fraud. You'd both be wise to stay someplace safe tonight away from your ranch, Caleb, in case this goes worse than we're hoping. Where do you suggest? Caleb asked. Boarding house, maybe? Or... Pruitt hesitated, glancing between them with something almost knowing. Given how this town's already treating Mrs. Ellis, might be safer to just stay together wherever that ends up being. Two sets of eyes watching each other's backs beats one set alone, way I see it. They left the sheriff's office with the injunction safely delivered into official hands and rode not back toward Caleb's smoking ruin of a barn, but toward the small cabin Caleb kept at the edge of his property, closer to town, that he explained had once housed a ranch hand before he'd let the position go unfilled these past lonely years. It's not much, he said, lighting a lamp inside, revealing a single room sparse but clean, but it's got a good lock on the door and only one way in. Safer than the main house tonight, I think, if Kane decides to try something worse. Margaret sat heavily on the room's single chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her all at once. 2 days of hard riding and terror and grief crashing down together now that the immediate danger had for the moment passed. Do you think it's over? She asked quietly. Once the sheriff serves that injunction, do you think Kane simply accepts it and lets the law take its course? Caleb was quiet a moment, banking the small stove with practiced efficiency. I think, he said finally, a man like Kane doesn't know how to accept losing gracefully. I think tonight and tomorrow are going to be the most dangerous hours we've faced yet, because a cornered man is always more dangerous than a comfortable one. He turned to look at her firelight, catching the exhaustion and worry plain in his weathered face. But I also think we've got proof now that even Kane can't simply burn away or threaten into silence. Judge Tate's got copies of everything. Marshals are coming according to the judge's own promise. However ugly the next day or two gets, Margaret, I believe we're closer to the end of this than the beginning. I hope you're right. So do I, he admitted, and something in the plain honesty of that admission, rather than frightening her, further settled something in her chest. Instead, the understanding that he wasn't offering her false comfort, wasn't pretending certainty. He didn't feel, but was simply honestly standing beside her through whatever came next, regardless of how frightened he might privately be. Yuck. Sheriff Pruitt returned just past midnight, and the news he brought was not the resolution either of them had hoped for. Kane's gone, he said, standing dripping in the cabin doorway, his broad face grim in the lamplight. House was empty. Servants say he rode out sudden not 2 hours after we would have reached him if we'd left straight from your place instead of stopping first. Somebody must have warned him because he cleared out fast, took cash from his office safe, according to what the housekeeper told us, and left in a hurry with 2 of his men. Where would he go? Margaret asked, fear coiling fresh and sharp in her chest. Don't rightly know, Pruitt admitted. But I'll tell you what worries me more, Mrs. Ellis. Man doesn't clear out his safe and vanish into the night unless he's either running for good or he's got one more play left he means to make before this territory's law catches up with him properly. His gaze moved between them both, careful and serious. I'd keep both eyes open the next few days. Man cornered and desperate. With resources still in hand, that's about the most dangerous combination there is. The sheriff left a deputy posted near the cabin for the remainder of the night, and Margaret lay awake long after the lamp had been extinguished, listening to Caleb's steady breathing across the small room, unable to fully quiet the fear churning through her chest, despite the deputy's presence outside. You're not sleeping. Caleb's voice came soft through the dark. Neither are you. No, he admitted. Can't seem to stop turning it over, where he's gone, what he means to do next. A pause, then quieter. Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honest. All right. If this goes bad, if Kane comes at us direct, tries something worse than fire, are you certain you want to keep fighting? There's no shame in it if you'd rather take what's left of your dignity and start fresh somewhere. Kane's reach doesn't extend. Nobody would think less of you for choosing safety over justice. Margaret was quiet a long moment, turning the question over honestly rather than answering reflexively. 11 years ago, she said finally. I married a man I loved in a town I thought I understood, and I believed foolishly, maybe that if I simply worked hard and treated people decent, I'd be treated decent in return. Her voice hardened slightly. This past week has taught me that belief was naive. But it's also taught me something else, Caleb. That there are still people in this world willing to stand up when it costs them something. Willing to fight for what's right, even when running would be easier. You've shown me that these past 2 days more clearly than anyone has shown me anything in a long while. She turned toward the sound of his breathing in the dark. I'm not running. Not from Kane and not from what's right. Whatever comes next, I mean to face it standing. Silence stretched between them a long moment, and then she heard him shift, heard the quiet creak of him crossing the small room, and felt him settle carefully onto the edge of her narrow cot close, but not presuming his presence solid and warm in the dark. Then we face it together, he said quietly. Whatever comes. She reached for his hand in the darkness, found it easily and held on. And for the first time since Ida Fawcett's door had shut in her face 4 nights before, Margaret Ellis fell asleep. Not from exhaustion alone, but from the simple, hard-won comfort of not facing the dark completely alone. Morning brought fresh trouble delivered by a breathless Danny Whitfield pounding on the cabin door before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Mrs. Ellis, Mr. Hart. His young voice carried real panic. You need to come quick. It's my pa. Kane's men took him in the night. Margaret's blood went cold. What? 2 men came to the house where you had us hidden, Danny said, tears streaking his dirty face. Took my paw right out of bed, said Kane wanted a word with him before he left the territory for good. My ma's beside herself. We don't know where they took him. Caleb was already reaching for his gun belt, his face gone hard and grim. This is what desperate looks like, he said quietly to Margaret. Kane's not running blind. He's tying up loose ends before he goes, starting with the one witness who can testify plainest to what those ledgers prove. We have to find him, Margaret said, fear for Elias Whitfield, sharp and immediate now. Danny, Caleb said, crouching to the boy's level. Think hard. Any place Kane might have taken your father. Any property, any cabin, anywhere he might go to ground before running for good. Danny wiped his face, thinking hard, despite his obvious terror. There's an old line shack, he said slowly. Up past Sawtooth Ridge. Kane uses it sometimes when he's out checking on grazing leases. Ain't hardly nobody knows about it, except bank folks, on account of it's on land the bank technically owns through some old foreclosure. That's it, Caleb said, already moving toward his horse. That's exactly the kind of place a man goes to ground when he wants privacy for something ugly. I'm coming, Margaret said immediately. Margaret, don't, she said, cutting off his protest before it could fully form. I'm not sitting safe in a cabin while a good man pays with his life for helping me. I'm coming, Caleb, and you're wasting time arguing about it. Something in her fierce, unmovable expression must have convinced him faster than any argument could have, because he simply nodded sharp and quick and helped her mount without further protest. Danny, Caleb said, ride for the sheriff. Tell him where we're headed. Tell him to bring the deputy and whatever men he can gather. We'll try to hold things steady till they arrive. But Danny, I want you safe with your mother, not riding into danger yourself. You understand me? Danny nodded, still crying but resolute, and took off toward town at a dead run, while Caleb and Margaret turned their horses toward Sawtooth Ridge, urgency driving them hard through country growing rougher and steeper with every mile. They found the line shack tucked into a fold of the hills, smoke rising thin from its chimney, 2 horses tied outside, and the moment they saw it, Caleb pulled up sharp, catching Margaret's reins to stop her from riding straight into the open. We go careful from here, he said quietly. Kane's desperate, which makes him unpredictable, and there's at least 2 of them in there besides Elias. We rush this wrong, somebody gets hurt worse than they already might be. They tied the horses well back in the trees and approached on foot, low and careful, until they were close enough to hear voices through the shack's thin walls. Kane's voice cold and controlled despite the circumstances, and beneath it, Elias Whitfield's, strained but still defiant. Won't find them, Elias was saying. Hide them well enough that you'll never... The sound of a fist connecting with flesh cut him off, and Margaret flinched hard. Only Caleb's steadying grip on her arm, keeping her from rushing the door immediately. You're a fool, Whitfield. Kane's voice came flat and dangerous. A fool who's about to lose considerably more than a few bruises if you don't tell me where those copies are hidden. I have a train to catch in 3 days, and I don't intend to spend my remaining time in this territory chasing paper trails you've been foolish enough to think could actually save you. Judge already has them, Elias said, voice thick with pain but unbowed. Copies are already delivered, Kane. You're too late. Whatever you do to me now changes nothing except adding kidnapping and assault to whatever charges are already waiting for you. A heavy silence followed, and then Kane's voice again, colder now, more dangerous. Then I suppose you've outlived your usefulness entirely, haven't you? Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs, and she looked to Caleb with wide, desperate eyes, understanding exactly what those words meant. Exactly how little time might be left before Kane made good on the threat sitting plain beneath them. Caleb held up 2 fingers, then pointed toward the shack's single window, then toward the door, communicating a plan. Without words that Margaret understood instinctively, he meant to draw attention through the window while circling to the door himself. She nodded, understanding her role without needing it spoken, and watched him move low and silent toward the shack's side, disappearing from her sightline entirely, leaving her alone in the trees with her heart hammering and every instinct screaming at her to do something, anything, rather than simply wait. A crash sounded from inside the shack. Caleb, she realized, throwing something through the window, as a distraction followed immediately by shouting chaos, the scrape of chairs, and the heavy thud of a struggle beginning. And Margaret didn't think, didn't plan, simply ran for the door with her heart in her throat. She burst through it to a scene of pure chaos. Caleb grappling with one of Cain's men near the overturned table, Elias slumped in a chair with his hands bound blood on his face, and Cain himself backing toward the shack's rear door, with a pistol raised its barrel swinging wildly between the struggling men, and Margaret's sudden entrance. "Stay back." Cain's voice cracked with something Margaret had never heard from him before, genuine fear, the composure of a man who had always controlled every situation, finally completely shattering under the weight of one closing too fast around him. "Stay back, or I swear I'll—" The pistol swung toward her, and Margaret froze every muscle, locked with terror, staring down the barrel of a gun held by a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. "Cain!" Caleb's voice cut through the chaos, and Margaret saw in her peripheral vision that he'd subdued Cain's man entirely, the second man groaning on the floor, and Caleb himself now standing with his own gun leveled steady at Cain's chest, close enough that neither man held any real advantage. "Put it down. This ends now one way or another." "You don't understand," Cain said, and his voice had gone thin, almost pleading now, the smooth confidence of the man who'd ridden into Caleb's yard days before, completely stripped away. "Everything I've built, everything, it's gone the moment those marshals arrive. Prison, or worse. I have nothing left to lose by finishing this properly." "You've got your life left to lose," Caleb said, voice steady despite the danger. "Put the gun down, Cain, and you walk out of here breathing whatever comes after in a courtroom. Don't, and I promise you this ends a great deal worse for you than a prison sentence." The standoff stretched agonizing and endless, Cain's hand visibly shaking, now his eyes darting between Caleb's steady gun and Margaret frozen by the door, some final desperate calculation working behind his panicked eyes. And then from outside the sound of approaching horses, many of them, and Sheriff Pruitt's voice, carrying loud and commanding through the morning air. "Silas Cain, this is Sheriff Pruitt. Come out with your hands raised, or we're coming in after you." Something in Cain seemed to collapse all at once, at the sound of it, the last of his desperate resolve crumbling under the weight of a fight. He finally fully understood he had lost. The pistol lowered slowly and clattered from his shaking hand onto the shack's rough floor. "It's over," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. Something broken and hollow in his voice, now that the careful mask of control had shattered entirely. "God help me, it's finally over." Caleb crossed quickly to secure Cain before the man's despair could shift back toward desperation, and Margaret rushed to Elias's side, working frantically at the ropes binding his hands. Tears of relief, finally breaking free now that the danger had passed. "You came?" Elias managed, his voice rough with pain, but steady with something like wonder. "I told them it was too late, that the marshals already had everything. But I confess I wasn't entirely certain you'd actually—" "Of course we came," Margaret said fiercely, finally freeing his hands, gripping them tight in her own. "You risked everything to help me, Elias. I wasn't about to let Cain finish what he started." Sheriff Pruitt and his deputies flooded into the small shack moments later, taking Cain and his remaining conscious man into custody with brisk efficiency, and Margaret stood in the chaos of it all, exhausted and shaking and overwhelmed, watching Caleb cross toward her through the wreckage of the fight, soot and dirt and fresh scrapes marking his face and hands. "You're all right?" he asked, urgent, checking her over with the same careful thoroughness she'd shown him after the barn fire. "I'm all right," she said, and found herself without quite deciding to stepping into his arms, holding on tight enough that neither of them needed to speak further about exactly how close this morning had come to ending in tragedy instead of rescue. "It's over," Margaret said softly into his shoulder, echoing Cain's own broken words, but meaning them entirely differently. Not defeat, but release 4 days of terror and grief and fighting. Finally fully unwinding into something that felt for the first time since Thomas's funeral. Genuinely, cautiously safe. "Not quite over," Caleb said gently, though his arms tightened around her all the same. "There's still a great deal of law left to sort through, still your house to secure properly, still a whole valley that owes you an apology it probably won't fully know how to give." He pulled back slightly, looking down at her with something warm and certain settling into his tired, weathered face. But the danger's past, Margaret. Whatever comes next, it comes without a man holding a gun to any of our chests. Sheriff Pruitt approached as his deputies led Kane handcuffed and hollow-eyed out toward the waiting horses. "We'll get him to the territorial jail in Prescott Junction," he said. "Judge Tate's already sent word that federal marshals are riding out to formally take over the investigation, given the scope of what those ledgers apparently prove. Man's looking at years, most likely once everything's properly accounted for." He glanced toward Elias, still shaky but upright now, with Danny's mother's borrowed coat draped over his shoulders, after someone had fetched it from town. "Whitfield, I'll want your full statement once you're properly seen to by a doctor. Same for you both," he added, looking to Caleb and Margaret. "But I think it's fair to say, given everything that's happened here today, this territory owes the three of you a considerable debt." They rode back toward Cedar Hollow, slower than they'd left it, exhaustion finally catching up fully with all of them. Elias secured safely in the sheriff's wagon to be tended by the town doctor, and Margaret found herself for the first time in what felt like an impossibly long stretch of days, simply breathing easy beside a man who had, in less time than she'd have thought possible, become the truest ally and the deepest comfort she had left in the entire world. "What happens now?" she asked quietly as Cedar Hollow's rooftops came into view against the afternoon sky. "To the house. To everything Kane's fraud stole from me. Judge Tate's injunction still stands," Caleb said. "Once the marshals finish their investigation and confirm what those ledgers already prove, I expect the foreclosure gets thrown out entirely, and the debt itself likely gets reduced to whatever your husband actually legitimately owed, which by Elias's own accounting was considerably less than what Kane was claiming." He glanced sideways at her. "You may find yourself with a house still standing, Margaret, and considerably less debt hanging over it than you woke up believing 4 days ago. And the town?" Margaret asked, thinking of Ida Fawcett's shut door, of Frank Dobbs's grasping hand, of a whole community that had turned its back on her in the space of a single terrible night. "What happens to how this town looks at me now after everything?" Caleb was quiet a moment, considering the question with the same careful honesty he brought to everything. "I expect," he said finally, "that a good many people in that town are going to feel considerable shame once the full truth of what Kane did comes out plain for everyone to see. Shame's a powerful thing, Margaret. Sometimes it hardens people further. But sometimes, if a person's willing, it opens them up. Instead, makes them see clearer going forward the cost of the cruelty they were too quick to hand out." He reached over, taking her hand where it rested on the saddle horn, steady and warm, despite everything the day had cost them both. "Whatever this town chooses to do with that shame, though, I want you to understand something plain, Margaret Ellis. You don't need their forgiveness to have already proven exactly what kind of woman you are. I saw it myself that first night in the rain, and I've seen it every single day since." Margaret felt tears rise warm and unashamed and let them fall freely as they rode the final stretch toward town, toward a house that might against every terrible odds of the past week still be hers, toward a future that suddenly impossibly felt like it might hold something worth having after all. Cedar Hollow looked different to Margaret as they rode in that afternoon, though she understood even as she noticed it that the town itself hadn't changed at all. Only her eyes had 4 days of fire and fraud and fear stripping away whatever illusions she'd once held about the place she'd called home for 11 years. Word had already traveled ahead of them, the way word always did in a town this size, and Margaret felt the weight of stares following them down Main Street, faces appearing in windows and doorways, some curious, some ashamed, none of them quite able to hold her gaze the way they might have a week before. Ida Fawcett stood in the doorway of the boarding house as they passed, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance, and Margaret watched something complicated move across the older woman's face. Not quite regret, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the first cracking of a certainty that had seemed 4 nights ago entirely unshakable. Margaret didn't stop. Didn't give Ida the satisfaction of an acknowledgement either way. She simply rode past chin level toward the doctor's office, where Elias Whitfield waited to be properly examined and let the silence behind her say whatever it needed to say. Dr. Sarah Kellerman, a brisk, no-nonsense woman who'd taken over the practice from her late father 2 years prior, tended to Elias's injuries with efficient care, pronouncing his ribs bruised, but not broken, his eye swollen, but his sight unaffected, and prescribed nothing more dramatic than rest, and the kind of watchful care his wife was already fussing to provide. "You're a fortunate man," Dr. Kellerman told him, "given what I'm hearing about how you came by these injuries. Fortunate to have friends willing to ride into danger for me," Elias said, glancing toward Margaret and Caleb with genuine warmth, despite his battered face. "Not every man can say that." The days that followed passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Federal marshals arriving from the territorial capital within the week, exactly as Judge Tate had promised, thorough and methodical in their investigation of Kane's banking records, interviewing half the town about debts and foreclosures and card games that had, upon closer scrutiny, revealed a pattern of fraud stretching back nearly 6 years and touching more families than Margaret had initially imagined. The Hendersons, the Millers, old Tobias Grant, who'd lost his cattle ranch to foreclosure 2 years prior under circumstances that, once properly examined, bore the same telltale signs of manufactured debt that had nearly claimed Margaret's own home. 6 years, Judge Tate said grimly when he rode out to Cedar Hollow personally to oversee the final stages of the investigation, sitting across from Margaret and Caleb in the parlor of Margaret's own house, hers again. Now officially, the foreclosure formally reversed the fraudulent debt struck entirely from the record. 6 years this man was quietly, methodically ruining families in this valley, all so he could buy up their land at a fraction of its worth once they'd been driven to desperation. "I've seen greed before, Mrs. Ellis. I've rarely seen it executed with this much patience, this much cold calculation." "What happens to him now?" Margaret asked. "Federal fraud charges extensive enough that he's unlikely to see freedom again for a very long while," Judge Tate said. "The territorial court's already begun proceedings to redistribute the properties he seized fraudulently back to their rightful owners where that's still possible. Some of the ranches have changed hands since, complicating matters, but for families like yours, Mrs. Ellis, where the fraud was caught before the land could be fully liquidated, I expect you'll see full restoration of your property, debt-free, within the month." The words landed in Margaret's chest with a weight she hadn't fully expected. Not simple relief, though that was there too, but something deeper, something that felt almost like the ground finally settling firm again, beneath feet that had spent a week walking on nothing but uncertainty. "And the others?" she asked. "The families who lost everything years ago before any of this came to light." "More complicated," Judge Tate admitted. "Some restitution will be possible through the sale of Kane's remaining assets. Won't make anyone entirely whole again, not after years of hardship, but it's more justice than this valley's seen out of that man in a long while, and considerably more than most folks expected when this started." It was nearly 3 weeks after the fire, after the arrest, after the slow grinding machinery of territorial law had finally begun, turning properly in favor of the people. Silas Kane had spent years grinding down, that Margaret found herself standing in her own kitchen, her kitchen again, truly hers. Now, the deed clean and clear in a drawer upstairs, watching Caleb repair a hinge on her back door that had been loose since before Thomas had died. "You don't have to keep doing that," she said, though there was no real protest in it, only the familiar warmth of watching him work. "Man's got to keep his hands busy," Caleb said, echoing words she'd heard him say more than once these past weeks, and glanced up at her with something soft in his tired gray eyes. "Besides, barn's rebuilt now mostly. House needs less tending than it used to. I find myself with time on my hands I don't rightly know what to do with some days." "Is that so?" Margaret crossed the kitchen, leaned against the counter near where he worked. "And what would you rather be doing with that time, Caleb Hart, if not fixing my hinges?" He set down his tools, slowly straightened, and looked at her with an expression she'd come to know well these past weeks. "Careful. deliberate a man weighing words before he spoke them, though something in his eyes suggested the weighing was mostly done now. "Margaret," he said, "I've been turning something over in my mind a good while now, and I find I can't rightly keep turning it over without saying it out loud." Her heart quickened, though she kept her voice steady. "Then say it." "That first night," he said, "I told you I had an empty house. Told myself at the time it was simple decency, nothing more, a man doing right by a woman in trouble, on account of not wanting to be the kind who could have helped, and didn't." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the careful, hopeful uncertainty in his weathered face. "But Margaret, that house hasn't felt empty in a good while now. Not since you walked into it soaking wet and grieving, with nothing but a carpetbag, and more courage than half this territory's put together. I don't want it to go back to being empty again. Not ever, if I've got any say in the matter." Margaret felt her breath catch, understanding plainly now exactly what he was working his way toward, and found herself for once entirely unable to summon a single word of her usual careful composure. "I know it soon." Caleb continued some of his earlier steadiness, fraying slightly under the weight of her silence. "I know you buried a husband less than a month back, and I know that's not near enough time for proper mourning by this valley's reckoning, and I know I've got no business asking a woman still finding her footing after everything Cain put her through." "Caleb!" Margaret reached up, pressed her fingers gently to his lips, stopping the flow of nervous words. "Ask me properly. Whatever it is you're working your way toward. I'd rather hear it plain than watch you talk yourself out of it." Something in his face steadied at that old fear giving way to quiet resolve, and he caught her hand, held it gently between both of his own. "Margaret Ellis," he said, "I know this town's got opinions about propriety, about how long a woman ought to wait before she lets herself be happy again after loss. I find these past weeks I care a great deal less about this town's opinions than I used to. What I care about is you and the life I think we could build together if you'll have me. I'm not asking for tomorrow or even next month. I'm asking whether you'd consider it. Whether there's room, in whatever you're rebuilding for yourself now, for a stubborn rancher who fell for you, somewhere between pulling you out of the rain and watching you march into a burning bank office, demanding justice for a man you'd known less than a day." Margaret felt tears rise warm and unashamed, and let herself, for the first time since Thomas's funeral, feel something that wasn't grief or fear or fury, something lighter. Something that had been building quietly beneath all of it these past 3 weeks, waiting patiently for room enough to breathe. "There's room," she said softly. "Caleb, there's more than room. I think I've known it myself for a while now, if I'm honest. Somewhere around that second night maybe, when you rode straight into a burning bank office for a stranger, or maybe earlier still, that first morning watching you split firewood for a woman you owed nothing to." She squeezed his hands tighter. "I'm not ready to remarry tomorrow. I need time, same as you said. Time to properly grieve what Thomas and I had, even knowing what he cost me in the end. Time to rebuild what's mine on my own 2 feet, before I build something new alongside someone else." She looked up at him steady and certain, despite the tears still standing in her eyes. "But yes, Caleb Hart. When that time comes, and I don't think it's so very far off, the answer is yes." Something in his weathered face broke open, then relief and joy and old grief finally fully unwinding together, and he pulled her into an embrace that carried none of the careful restraint he'd shown these past weeks. Only plain, unguarded gladness. The town's reckoning, when it came, arrived slower and more complicated than Margaret had expected, but it came all the same. Ida Fawcett appeared at Margaret's door on a bright Sunday morning, some 6 weeks after the fire, standing stiff and uncertain on the porch steps, in a way that Margaret found, despite everything, she took no particular satisfaction in witnessing. "Margaret," Ida said, and something in her usually sharp voice had gone genuinely uncertain. "I owe you an apology. A proper one, not just words tossed off in passing." "You don't owe me anything, Ida," Margaret said, though she made no move to close the door either. "I do." Ida's chin trembled, old pride visibly warring with old shame. I turned you away that night, Margaret. Turned you out into the rain, into danger, because I let myself believe you'd somehow earned it, that your husband's failings were your own to be punished for. I knew better. I've known better my whole life about how this valley ought to treat its widows, and I let fear of Silas Kane's opinion override every ounce of decency I was raised with. Her eyes filled, and for once in all the years Margaret had known her, Ida Fawcett looked genuinely, plainly humbled. I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to hear it said properly before more time passed and I lost the nerve entirely. Margaret studied her a long moment, feeling the old anger from that terrible night rise briefly, and then unexpectedly settle again. Not gone, not fully forgiven, but no longer sharp enough to serve any purpose beyond bitterness. She didn't particularly want to keep carrying. Thank you for saying it, Margaret said finally. I won't pretend that night didn't hurt Ida. It did more than I think you fully understand, but I'd rather use what's left of my life building something good than nursing a grudge against every soul who failed me when I needed them most. So I accept your apology, and I hope going forward this valley remembers the lesson Kane's downfall taught it about who deserves protecting and who deserves scrutiny. Ida left with tears in her eyes and something like genuine gratitude in her bearing, and Margaret closed the door behind her, feeling lighter than she'd expected. One more piece of the old wreckage finally properly set down. Frank Dobbs proved less easily redeemed. He'd fled Cedar Hollow entirely within days of Kane's arrest, word reaching town eventually that he'd been picked up 2 counties over on charges related to his own role in intimidating Kane's various targets over the years, facing a reckoning of his own that Margaret found she had no particular sympathy left to spare for. Elias Whitfield, once fully recovered, found himself appointed as the bank's new manager under territorial oversight, his integrity throughout the whole ordeal earning him a trust from the community that Margaret suspected would serve both him and the valley well for years to come. Feels strange, he told Margaret and Caleb one evening, the 3 of them sharing supper on Margaret's porch as autumn settled cool and gold over the valley. Sitting behind that same desk where Kane once conducted his business, knowing what I know now about everything that happened in that room. But I mean to run things different going forward. Fair terms, honest books, and God help any man who tries to twist those numbers again while I'm the one keeping them. This valley's fortunate to have you, Margaret said sincerely. After everything you risked to help me, Elias, I don't think I'll ever be able to properly thank you. You already have, Elias said, smiling despite the faint scar still visible near his eye. You stood up when it would have been easier not to, and that gave the rest of us the courage to stand up alongside you. That's worth more than any thanks, Margaret. That's worth a whole valley finally remembering what decency's supposed to look like. Winter came early that year, sharp and clean after a long autumn, and Margaret found herself more days than not at Caleb's ranch rather than her own house in town, the 2 of them building slowly, carefully toward the future they'd agreed to wait for that afternoon in her kitchen. It was Sam. No, she caught herself smiling at the small habit of nearly borrowing names from stories she'd heard told around town. Fires these past months? Stories of other valleys, other struggles, other strangers who'd walked into towns needing shelter and left, having changed everything. It was Danny Whitfield, grown taller and steadier these past months, who brought the letter that finally settled the last uncertainty hanging over Margaret's future. Territorial courts finalized everything. Danny reported proudly having taken to occasional bank errands under his father's careful supervision. Your property's fully clear, Mrs. Ellis. Deeds clean, no debts attached, and there's actually a settlement coming your way too from the sale of some of Kane's other assets. Compensation, the judge called it, for what you went through on account of his fraud. Margaret read through the official documents with Caleb standing close beside her, feeling the last of the fear and uncertainty from that terrible rain-soaked night finally fully dissolve into something solid and secure. It's really over, she said softly. All of it. The debt, the fraud, the fear of losing everything Thomas and I built. It's over, Caleb agreed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, steady and warm against the winter chill. And whatever comes next, Margaret, you get to decide it fresh without Kane's shadow hanging over any part of it. They married the following spring, when the last snow had cleared from the high ridges, and wildflowers had begun pushing up through ground that had spent a long winter resting in a ceremony, held not in the church that had once turned its collective back on her, but in the churchyard itself, under open sky, surrounded by a town that had slowly and imperfectly learned something true about mercy and second chances. Elias Whitfield stood as witness alongside his wife and children, Danny grinning wide enough to split his face, and even Ida Fawcett attended standing near the back, with tears she made no effort to hide. Her earlier shame transformed over the months into something like genuine investment in Margaret's happiness. Sam Hendricks, a rancher from 2 valleys over who'd heard the whole story and ridden in specifically to shake Caleb's hand, having lost land himself years back, to circumstances eerily similar to what Kane had orchestrated here, stood near the front with Judge Tate, who'd made the long ride out specifically to officiate, refusing to let anyone else claim the honor. "I've married a good many couples across this territory," Judge Tate said, addressing the small, warm gathering. "But I confess I've rarely officiated a union that felt quite so thoroughly deservedly earned as this one." These two didn't simply fall in love, friends. They fought for each other, fought for justice, fought for a whole valley's worth of families who'd nearly lost everything to greed and cruelty. If that's not the foundation of a marriage built to last, I don't know what is. Margaret stood in a simple gown sewn by her own hands, wildflowers woven through her hair by Danny's younger sisters, and looked at Caleb's steady-weathered, patient Caleb, who'd stepped out of a rainstorm 9 months before, and offered her nothing but an empty house and an honest heart, and had in the months since given her back everything Silas Kane's cruelty had tried to steal. "Do you, Caleb Hart?" Judge Tate said, "Take this woman to be your wife, to stand beside her through whatever storms this territory might yet throw your way." "I do," Caleb said, steady and certain, his gray eyes never leaving hers. "Been doing it a good while already, truth told. Just makes it official now." "And do you, Margaret Ellis, take this man to be your husband?" Margaret looked at the man who'd refused to walk past a stranger in trouble, who'd ridden into a burning barn without hesitation, who'd stood beside her through fraud and fire and threat, without ever once asking for anything in return but the chance to do right by someone who needed it. "I do," she said, and meant it more completely than she'd have thought possible, standing in the rain 9 months before, with nowhere left to go. "Every day, for as long as I've got left to give it." They kissed as the small crowd erupted into applause. Spring sunlight, breaking warm across a valley that had in the space of less than a year watched corruption expose, justice served, and love built, stubbornly, deliberately out of the wreckage of a night that had once seemed like the very bottom of what one woman could survive. That evening, as the celebration wound down and the last guests made their way back toward town, Margaret and Caleb stood together on the porch of what was now fully and completely their shared home. The ranch house rebuilt stronger after the fire, the barn standing solid again, cattle grazing peaceful across land that no longer lived under any man's shadow but their own honest labor. "Do you remember?" Margaret said, leaning into his shoulder, watching the last gold light fade over the ridgeline. "What you said to me that first night, when I told you I had nowhere left to go?" "I remember it plain," Caleb said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Told you I had an empty house." "It's not empty anymore," Margaret said softly. "No." Caleb agreed, and something in his weathered voice carried the full, quiet weight of everything they'd survived together. The rain and the fraud, the fire and the fear, the slow, careful building of trust into something that had proven in the end strong enough to outlast every threat a desperate, greedy man could throw against it. "Hasn't been empty since the night you walked into it, Margaret Hart, and it never will be again." She smiled at the sound of her new name, still unfamiliar and already beloved, and looked out over the valley spreading gold and green below them, a valley that had nearly lost itself to one man's cruelty, and had instead, through the stubborn courage of a grieving widow and a lonely rancher who'd refused to walk past a stranger's pain, found its way back to something worth calling home. The rain that had once seemed to Margaret Ellis like the cruelest night of her life had in the end carried her straight into the truest, steadiest love she would ever know, and standing now on the porch of a house that would never again know the ache of empty rooms, She understood with complete and unshakable certainty that sometimes the darkest storms carry a person not toward ruin, but toward exactly the home they were always meant to find.